Hello, my name is David Mitchell. I'm a professor of English at George Washington University, and I want to talk tonight about some novels that my partner Sharon Snyder and I have been developing that we call anti-normative novels. They're contemporary novels that attempt to diagnose normative cognition, normative modes of being and navigating the world in order to create more space and flexibility for disabled bodies to also navigate those worlds which are often not made for them as well. The title of the talk is The Capacities of Incapacity, CripQueer Bodyminds in Anti-Normative Novels. And what I want to do here is just open up with a little précis about what we're attempting to do here and why these novels are so significant in our estimation. So in this talk, we group contemporary novelistic approaches to disability. These novels, which we will refer to throughout as anti-normative novels of embodiment, represent CripQueer bodies as productive difference in order to reveal ways to approach peripheral embodiment. That's our term, talking about bodies and minds that are set aside and thought to be undesirable or unvalued. As what Kevin Floyd, who's a CripQueer Marxist scholar, describes as a certain kind of skilled labor, and I'll go back to that concept in a minute. Taken collectively, these narratives provide a repertoire of tools to expose examples of what Darwin called in The Origin of Species, that he published in 1859, descent with modification, the random mutating path of evolution that links all organisms to a shared evolutionary history of ancestral structures and potentially adaptive futures. Anti-normative novels of embodiment represent forms of narrative adaptation, moving consciously away from traditions of representational deployments of disability as a metaphor of individual and or social collapse, as we analyze in our second book, Narrative Prosthesis, Disability and the Dependencies of Discourse, that was published by the University of Michigan in the year 2000. Here we want to build on our prior analyses of productive, non-normative filmic and internet forms by examining alternative neoliberal narrative spaces as allowing some movement toward an alternative representational tradition of those living lives in peripheral embodiments. And I want to jump down here to my next slide and begin with a couple of epigraphs. The first one is from Michel Foucault's The History of Madness. And in this quote, Foucault writes, "This negative differential notion of madness as pathology first appeared in the 18th century to explain variations and diseases rather than adaptations and convergences." And one of the reasons we like that quote is because it historicizes pathology, talks about it as having a particular kind of cultural and historical locus and focus that hasn't always been with us. In some ways, one could say, Foucault harkens back to the Middle Ages as the golden age of inclusiveness, in the sense that bodies weren't held out and stigmatized because so many bodies were susceptible to, like, the Black Plague and various kinds of impairments that living in that particular period entailed or brought about. And then the second quote is from Adrienne Rich's Perot Le Fou. So working from Michel Foucault's first book after he graduated, and then Adrienne Rich's later poem. And in the poem Pierre Le Fou, the narrator tells us, I would tell all the stories I knew in which people went wrong, but the nervous system was going right all along. Within the anti-normative novel of embodiment, plot turns increasingly rely on the revelation of the normative body's secreted dysfunctionality, the perennial operations of embodiment that cover over inbuilt biological inefficiencies, disjunctures, weaknesses, and incapacities. In order to reverse the usual line of diagnosis imposed upon disabled bodies, these novels emphasize normalcy as reliant on a mechanistic adherence to scripts of pathology in other bodies to maintain fictive formulas of narrative embodiment. Within embodied scripts of normativity, the disabled body is culturally positioned as a derivative identity, secondary and inferior to norms of able-bodiedness. Yet, while the normative body may emerge as little more than a cultural phantom of expectations, a historically reiterated and overvalued pattern of how bodies must do things and how they must appear, within the anti-normative novel, disability is redeployed in the service of displacing hegemonic able-bodied norms. Within these plots, the able-bodied hegemon, rendered sensible as an amalgam of median capacities and forged in the exclusionary space between dynamic bodies and normative architectures, aesthetics, and functionalities, emerges as a fetishized product of bare life, while referencing disability as the dissonant expression of a distant kinship, the displacement of proximity from the norm suggested by our use of the phrase peripheral embodiment. Alternatively, the anti-normative novel of embodiment explores disability as revelatory of variation's potential for innovation, and in its wake identifies normative embodiment as an impossible attainment of a body's smooth functioning, to which post-Fordist strategies of liberal inclusionism stubbornly cling. Throughout this presentation, and as a follow-up to our critiques of inclusionist practices developed under neoliberal education, we want to foreground and argue neoliberalism requires vigilance on behalf of full bodily capacitation. Then disability serves as a key indicator of bodies falling away from truth. That's a quote from Stanley Elkins's The Magic Kingdom, which we also group in this particular set of novels, of contemporary novels of this tradition, the anti-normative novel. A failure of personal upkeep to adequately maintain one's embodiment within an acceptable range of social norms of ableist comportment. Here then, and in the parlance of new disability materialisms, we might say that within neoliberalism, disability operates in at least two distinct domains. One, disability actively references the United States' claim to global exceptionalism with respect to disability. The idea, which was forwarded by John Kerry when he was Secretary of State, that the inclusive adoption of policies toward disabled people are a sign of the United States' embrace of diversity under neoliberalism. And two, anti-normative novels of embodiment employ disability's radical potential to unseat traditional understandings of normalcy as subject integrity, cognitive coherency, and typical functionality. The first mode involves disability as a sign of neoliberalism's tolerance of dissent, of difference, i.e., a rhetoric of inclusionism realized by claims to American exceptionalism. The second mode unveils the capacities of incapacity that disability embodies as a key strategy in the anti-normative novel of embodiment's neo-materialist revelation of imperfection as a creative biological force. By identifying the novels under discussion here as neo-materialist or immanent materialist, we seek to identify their formative role as part of a tradition of alternative thinking regarding the agency of materiality developing within neoliberalism, but also hostile to its more reductive integrations. Neo-materialist thought is sometimes characterized as a return of the body or a more materialist corporeality after the pervasive recourse to cultural agency found in the interpretations of social constructivist thought. Neo-materialism characterizes a threat to neoliberal concepts of tolerance for non-normativity because, as Rudy Brododi characterizes it, the reaction to, quote, this trend has caused both the neoliberal and the neo-Kantian thinkers to be struck by high levels of anxiety about the sheer thinkability of the human future, end quote. In neo-materialism, living matter becomes an agent in its own right, rather than passively imprinted, inert space of matter within a hierarchically organized overvaluation of the human as a product of acculturation. Within neo-materialism, corporeality, both human and non-human, becomes a subject rather than an object. And this alternative emphasis results in the rethinking of a biocentered perspective that affects the very fiber and structure of social subjects. While disability and impairment have been subject to imprisoning cultural concepts of inferiority, neo-materialisms reactivate the materiality of any form of differential embodiment as a potentially active, agential, and adaptive site of species innovation. In Elizabeth Gross's terms, quote, as a neo-materialist, I develop a concept of life, bare life, where freedom is conceived not only or primarily as the elimination of constraint or coercion, but more positively as the condition of or capacity for action in life, end quote. The readings that follow regarding the representational tactics of disability evolved within anti-normative novels of embodiment explicate the creative agencies of CripQueer materialities as instances of adaptive knowledge and strategies of the pursuit of being that exceed neoliberal normative scripts of tolerance for those, quote, engaging the discrepant materialisms, end quote, of peripheral embodiments. And that quote is from Crux. So what I want to do here is, in the interest of time and to move us along so that you get a good sense of perhaps where we're going, I want to foreground a reading of a novel by Mark Haddon called Curious Incidents of the Dog in the Nighttime. However, before I do that, I want to just point out other examples that are in this discussion that we've taken up as examples of the anti-normative novel, including, as I mentioned already, Stanley Elkins's The Magic Kingdom, which involves a group of disabled and terminally ill children going from the UK to Disney World on a kind of Make-A-Wish charity trip. Operation Wandering Soul, which is also by Richard Powers, which is about a dystopic future hospital in Los Angeles, where the disabled children on the ward piece together a kind of large pattern of the sacrifice of disabled children among the world's stories. And they staged their own version of the Pied Piper in order to emphasize that the ironic ending, which is that there are 4 children who are so disabled they can't keep up with the children who are following the Pied Piper to their deaths, are left behind fortuitously. The Goldbug variations, which is Powers' meditation on DNA and the neurological system that can rewrite itself in various ways. And then last, the discussion of Capgras for his protagonist, Mark Schluter, after a truck accident that he has, called The Echo Maker. So just to give you a sense of the kind of range of works that we deal with, but we're just going to focus on one in particular tonight. And this is an allusion to the slide that I talked about before, where I cited Kevin Floyd as understanding CripQueerness as a kind of skilled labor, that it takes labor and creativity to navigate worlds that are not set up for you and are set up to exclude you. And then I cited Darwin earlier in his Origins of the Species, particularly his concept of descent with modification, where he argues that human beings could never handle the formal leadership of trying to get the organism to adapt in particular ways in order to eliminate forms of life that we assume are undesirable, and instead tell stories, for instance, about like a caribou herd of elks who have a variety of hair, short, medium, and long, and how when the caribou herd of elks moves from south to north, some of those particular hair lengths are privileged while others are not. And that kind of species adaptation is really the accident, the unanticipated salvation of variation. And we want to use that concept in order to read these novels that we're talking about. But tonight's main feature is a book by UK author Mark Haddon, The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, which has also been made into a stage play and has enjoyed some significant success. And in this section of the paper, which we call Lycocopy in the Jungle, and we'll explain where that quote comes from in Haddon's book and why we think it's so central to it. I want to start off and offer some ways in which Christopher Allen Boone, who's the protagonist, who's somewhere on the disability autistic spectrum, and serves as the narrator of The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, understands normative capacity as, in fact, secreting its own dysfunctionality. A similar revelation of the incapacities of normative cognition can be found in Mark Haddon's The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, wherein his protagonist, Christopher, who could be described as existing on the autistic spectrum, explains his experience of non-normative consciousness similar to that of Powers, whose protagonist has Capgras, Mark Schluter, in The Echo Maker, as an, quote, over-attentiveness to small details. That's how Christopher diagnoses his main problem, end quote. According to Christopher, going into a field of cows results in a level of observation that cannot be accommodated by normative models of rational description. And here's the quote. There were 31 more things in this list of things I noticed, but Siobhan said I didn't need to write them all down. Siobhan is his special education teacher in a school that he goes for that is segregated and just for disabled children. And it means that it is very tiring if I am in a new place because I see all these things. And if someone asked me afterward what the cows look like, I could ask, which one? Like Powers' anti-normative characterization strategy, Haddon's formulation of alternative cognition patterns for those on the autistic spectrum reveals a universe of excessive diversity, if it's possible to use the phrase in a more productive sense, one where loss is revealed as residing in those clinging to reductivist principles of normative consciousness, a form of knowing perhaps best described as ways of not knowing. At one key point in the novel, Christopher diagnoses this problem for those with normative cognition as glancing. And here's his quote. Quote, but most people are lazy. They never look at everything. They do what is called glancing, which is the same word for bumping off something and carrying on in almost the same direction, e.g., when a snooker ball glances off another snooker ball, and the information in their head is really simple, end quote. So in one respect, this attention to an abundance of detail marks an aspect of the capacities of incapacity involved in autistic cognition. In another respect, the need to reduce one's susceptibility to overstimulating situations also fuels ways to imagine alternative disability universes. Myriad examples of locating more hospitable ecologies in order to wall off excess detail occur throughout the novel, as when Christopher puts his hands over his ears, closes his eyes, and rolls forward until hunched up with his forehead pressed onto the ground, when physically accosted by another, such in the early scenes with the policeman who believe that he's killed the neighbor's dog, Wellington, and that he sets out to disprove. Or when he crawls between the wall of the shed, the fence, and the rainwater tub and covers himself with a fertilizer sack to hide after discovering his father is the murderer of the neighbor's dog, Wellington. Or when he escapes from a policeman by stowing his body on a luggage shelf during a train ride to London to live with his mother. These activities of shutdown, stimming, and self-isolation in tiny places demonstrate the extent to which Christopher actively shrinks the circumference of his interactions with humans in order to protect himself from normate onslaughts. Further, like Mark and his intimate relation to cranes, Christopher pursues a variety of cross-species identifications in his pursuit of alternative ecologies within which he might flourish in his CripQueer capacities of being. Throughout the novel, he likens his existence to other animals that enjoy being alone, identifying asociality as a viable option for one who experiences interactions with others as a barrier. Quote, and eventually there is no one. Quote, and eventually there is no one left in the world except people who don't look at other people's faces. And they like being on their own. And I hardly ever see them because they are like okapi in the jungle in the Congo, which are a kind of antelope and very shy and rare, end quote. The CripQueer poet like Claire, a transgender man with cerebral palsy, declares similarly in the film Self-Preservation, The Art of Revelair, quote, I don't like being around people. I've always led a somewhat willful existence where being alone in nature is preferable to interacting with other human beings. Such expressions of alternative pleasures found in isolation from humans who compose an inaccessible space where interaction with others is the barrier exposed way of being that would find inclusionism a source of oppression rather than limitation. The anti-normative novel of embodiment privileges disability as a failure of realizing expectations of normalcy, a source of innovation that runs consciously counter to sociality's insistence on the all-encompassing power of stigmatizing cultural inscriptions. To be clear, This alternative approach to disability is not a story of overcoming, where the limited body exceeds its social expectations in an approximation of normative modes of relating to the world. Nor is it representational mechanism, one that uses disability as a metaphor for ailments that prove social rather than bodily, as does the story of female hysteria, for instance, in Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper. And perhaps most liberational of all, these are not inclusivist stories of the ways in which disabled people are rescued by their similarity to some abstract majority of others. The anti-normative novel of embodiment surfaces with a version of non-normative materiality that proves more innovative for its truthfulness to the imperfections of organicity than its more culturally performative normative cousins. In turn, these works also locate an overlooked creativity, the skilled labor required of living with disabilities, as the realization of forms of subjectivity that expand alternatives for living in the world. Whereas social constructionist-based theories suppress the innovations supplied by corporeality in the name of anti-essentialism, anti-normative novels of embodiment revel in the degree to which fiction can deploy disability to demonstrate the insufficiency of social investments in normative stasis, a defining feature of a desire for sameness residing at the foundation of neoliberal social domains created by inclusionist practices. The capacity of incapacity to which we are referring as an alternative corporeal-based methodology turns for its insights on a form of biological materialism reinterpreted as a critique of pathology's normative referencing frame. This immanent materialist approach depends upon reimagining life, as that which can never be stable, that which must undergo change both in itself at the level of individuals and over generations at the level of species or even populations. In Elizabeth Gross's poetic explication of alternative materialities that might well be applied to lives such as Christopher's and others occupying center stage in anti-normative novels of embodiment, quote, matter is organized differentially in its inorganic and organic forms. This organization is dependent on the degree of indeterminacy, the degree of freedom that life exhibits relative to the inertia of matter, the capacity that all forms of life in varying degrees have to introduce something new. This something new, a new action, a new use of matter, a new arrangement or organization is brought into existence not through complete immersion in matter, but through the creation of a distance that enables matter to be obscured, to be cast in a new light, or rather, to have many of its features cast into shadows. We would end by offering the explanation of Gross's paraphrase of Darwin's evolutionary method as a means for understanding the radical literary history of embodiment offered up by anti-normative novels of embodiment, a historical outcropping of narrative experiments within neoliberalism's insufficient embrace of disability as diversity. The anti-normative novel of embodiment emerges in a post-Fordist fetishistic expansion of the marketing of difference made available by neoliberal biopolitics extant in late liberalism. Such strategies of inclusion effectively undermine the material alternatives that queer and disabled bodies actually provide. The anti-normative novel of embodiment's most radical critique develops in an interim space, that which queer narrative theorist Ross Chambers refers to as oppositional narratives' tactical exploitation of room for maneuver. Disability's revelatory capacity to reveal incapacity as a viable alternative to the reification of the value of normativity. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you found that explication, that examination of Mark Haddon's The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Night helpful and useful. And thank you very much.